Hello, Social Studies 9. Welcome to your first YouTube video. Today we're going to be learning about Napoleon and the French Empire. This is the successor to the French Revolution that we're learning about. Napoleon's a very interesting figure in world history, and this doesn't really give him justice. He's one of the great conquerors of all time in terms of land that he's conquered, ambition, political system he created. He's quite despite the jokes made about his small size, he's quite a larger-than-life figure. So we learned previously that Napoleon had taken power in a coup d'etat in 1799, and he became the first consul of France. One thing about Napoleon, as we see a picture of him, is that he wasn't as short as he was made out to be. We often call short, angry people saying they have a Napoleonic complex. Napoleon was average height for his time. He was 5'6" or 5'7". French inches were bigger than British inches. So I think in French inches he was 5'2", and so the British just claimed he was 5'2" in British inches. So, what was Napoleon's goal? Why did he become such a great conqueror? Why did he want to be? Like many people, such as Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, he wanted to become an immortal in history. He wanted to become famous and well-known and remembered. Napoleon was an opportunist. He had very strong decision-making ability. He could analyze things very quickly, and he was a very, very hard worker. We often see that lazy people do not become the great historical figures. Napoleon wanted national unity and order. So he was in favor of the French Revolution overall, and he agreed with many of the changes, but he did not like the chaos that happened and the disorder. So he wanted to create a system that had a strong centralized government. And he wanted to build this government around himself, requiring loyalty to him. When Napoleon consolidated his power, he declared that the revolution was over and that the positive ideas of the revolution needed to be consolidated, but that some of the parts of the revolution had gone too far. And we can think of what happened during the Terror and the strong egalitarianness. Napoleon thought that was too far. So how did he rule? So he centralized executive power to control important state institutions like the army. So he didn't want to rule with three equal branches like we learned about between the legislative, executive, and judiciary. He wanted a very strong executive. Napoleon wasn't purely a dictator. He also would hear from the people using something called a plebiscite, which is a referendum. So he would have an important vote like, should I stay dictator for 4 more years, or should I become emperor, or something like this? And he would put that to a vote with the French people so they could have their say on important issues. There was also elected advisors that could be used to measure public opinion. They didn't have power, but he could listen to them, and that would help him gauge what policies he should have. So it was different than a lot of the dictators of history, is that he still thought that the public did have a role to play and that their opinions were still important because that could help him rule better and be better liked, which he wanted, and stronger. So as consul, Napoleon first turned on the royalists. At first, the royalists thought that maybe he was going to bring back the king. Then he turned on the Jacobins, and anybody who revolted against him during this early phase could have their villages burned down. Napoleon thought that the Catholic Church had an important role to play in French society, but he didn't bring it back the way it was during the Ancien regime, during the time of the absolute monarchy, because he also kept protections and tolerations for minority religions such as Protestants and Jewish people. Napoleon did go backwards on freedom of the press, so he would censor newspapers that were overly critical of him, and he would control information. So this picture is Napoleon's coronation ceremony. There should be Napoleon and Josephine and the Pope picture. So after an assassination attempt on Napoleon, he made a plebiscite asking the people of France whether or not he should become emperor based on the Roman model. 99% people approved it. To me, this is very suspicious. Usually when any election is over 70% or something, something's a bit fishy, although some historians have said that this did reflect Napoleon's very, very high popularity at the time. So on December 4th, 1804, Napoleon is crowned emperor, and in a very famous move, instead of letting the Pope crown him, as had happened to Charlemagne 1,000 years before this, which kind of subordinated Charlemagne to the Catholic Church, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope and put it on his own head, representing that Napoleon was kind of a self-made emperor, and that power came from himself and not from some other authority. And Napoleon becoming emperor was explained by Madame de Remusat. Men worn out by the turmoil of the revolution looked for the domination of an able ruler. So while emperor, Napoleon put a very important legal code in place, which is still used in many places around the world, especially parts of the former French Empire in Africa, for example. So civil equality for men, civil marriage, so not church marriage, legalized divorce, church rights abolished, so the church had no special rights, and changes in inheritance. So it wouldn't only go to the oldest son, for example. And Napoleon took advantage of some of these rules in his code himself. For example, he did get divorced in his life. So Napoleon is a tactical and strategic genius when it comes to military. So let's look at his military system. So military was a central element of his diplomacy. So diplomacy, you're negotiating with other countries to get this or that. He would often use war or the threat of war to get what he wanted from other countries. When he was fighting, he aimed for decisive battles. So that means one battle where he could knock out the enemy army and force a peace treaty on his enemies. He drafted a very large army, and instead of burdening the army and slowing it down with a supply train, he would instruct his soldiers to live off the land, so to take food from the locals and local fields and stuff like this. So obviously this could cause resentment in countries occupied by the French army. And this contributed to the creation of a German national identity, for example, because many Germans, where a lot of Napoleon's wars took place, became resentful that this foreign force was there and that they were eating their food and living in their houses and all these types of things. Napoleon tried to avoid forts and sieges. He didn't want to get bogged down. He wanted to keep his army mobile. Napoleon divided his armies into several corps. Corps means body in French. And each corps had several divisions. So the corps worked in cooperation, and the divisions within the corps worked in cooperation. And so this way he could divide his army and launch like big pincher movements and feints, decoys, things like this, whereas most of the other European armies were just one big army, or armies that weren't very well coordinated. And Napoleon used maneuver on the flanks, that means the side of the battle line. And in the center, he had a grand battery of concentrated cannons, so his artillery. Napoleon was an artillery officer, so he was very innovative on the artillery. So the grand battery would blast through the center, and his cavalry would try to flank around the opponents on the sides. This would create a double threat. So we'll look at a few of his most famous battles. First one was the Battle of Ulm that we'll look at. This wasn't one particular battle, it was a campaign of maneuver in, sorry, that date's wrong, 1805. Napoleon managed to surround the entire Austrian army. He did this by marching his corps in different directions, which confused Austria, and then ended up linking them together, creating a pocket of the entire Austrian army. So almost the entire Austrian army, 25,000 Austrian soldiers were captured at a cost of only 1,000 French dead. And because the Austrian army was captured, Napoleon could advance and capture Vienna within a month. A stunning defeat. However, during this time, Napoleon faced a large naval defeat. So at this time, Spain was part of the French Empire. They were a kind of an associated state, we could say, and the Spanish and French army had combined to try to match the British fleet, which was generally seen as the most powerful fleet. The French wanted to invade Britain, but they had to gain naval superiority. So the British Admiral Horatio Nelson, who is one of the all-time great heroes of the British Empire, did a very risky maneuver. As you can see here, he did a double charge into the center of the French-Spanish line, so kind of a double T, putting his ships at great risk because the sides of the French and Spanish ships, where most of the cannons were facing the fronts of the English ships, where there are fewer cannons. However, he managed to cross a T, so he managed to cut through these lines and get his ships in the middle, isolating French and Spanish boats in this section and getting the sides of the British ships facing the backs and fronts of the French and Spanish ships, giving them a lot more area to shoot. However, Nelson was killed by a sniper during this battle. So here's Nelson. We'll see in many cities in the British Empire, Nelson Street, including Vancouver's a Nelson Street, or Trafalgar Street. And Vancouver also has a Trafalgar Street. So Napoleon wasn't actually part of this battle, but this impacted his ability to threaten Britain. The Battle of Austerlitz was the next big battle Napoleon was part of. This was a combined battle between the Austrians, Russians versus the French, so sometimes called the Battle of the Three Emperors. And Napoleon wanted to take advantage of poor coordination between the Austrians and Russians and separate the armies. So he weakened his right flank, so this area, so the Austrians would charge fourth. And then when they charged fourth, there would be a gap open between the Austrians and the Russians that he could cut through and split the armies from each other. And this caused both the armies to break. So after Austerlitz, Austria sued for peace and gave up its lands in Italy and Bavaria to France and paid France a lot of money. and the Russian soldiers were allowed to return home. Napoleon wanted to create a peace treaty with the Russian Emperor, Alexander. Next is Napoleon had to deal with Prussia at the Battle of Vienna. So Napoleon tried to encircle the Prussian army. The Prussian army, which was usually known for its discipline, saw that it was being encircled because its flanks broke. So instead of holding and fighting, the army fled backwards. And so much of the army did manage to save itself. However, Prussia was not able to regroup and surrendered. Soon after this, Sweden asked for a peace treaty with Napoleon. So now Napoleon was only fighting Britain. All the other powers in Europe had peace treaties with him and were part of his continental trade system. However, Napoleon made a mistake of invading Portugal. Britain came to Portugal's defense and soon started invading occupied Spain, and more Spanish people became tired of French domination and started revolting, especially after Napoleon's brother became king of Spain. So the Spanish that were revolting against the French were called guerrillas, which means warrior in Spanish. And so this is the beginning of the term guerrilla warfare in English, although it had existed throughout history. So the guerrillas caused massive losses for the French, because when Napoleon's troops were foraging for food, because they were living off the land, they would often be attacked just in these small groups. And then France would retaliate by destroying villages, and it was a very bloody, nasty campaign. A lot of Spanish civilians were tortured, women were raped, but the French continually lost ground, and they weren't being very successful in this. Even though they could win most big encounters, they couldn't keep their troops adequately supplied and control the countryside. And here comes Napoleon's big mistake. Never invade Russia from the west. So at this time, France controlled even more than what's gray. So the green were either directly controlled or puppet states of France, but Austria was now surrendered and aligned with France. Same with Prussia, same with Sweden, same with Denmark. And Napoleon came to control more of Europe than probably anybody else in history, including Hitler. He didn't control the Ottoman Empire, though. So he decided to try to force Russia back into his continental trading system, because Russia was trading with Britain. He wanted to cut all trade from Europe to Britain off to kind of starve Britain's economy. So he created one of the largest armies in history at that point, 600,000 people altogether. The French army had been bigger, but was spread out among various areas, but 600,000 just for one campaign. Russia saw this huge army and did not want to engage with him. They saw Napoleon was always going for a decisive battle. So they would only fight him when his troops were foraging for food, and a bunch of smaller engagements. That they didn't want him to score a decisive victory and destroy their army. As the Russians retreated, as Napoleon advanced farther and farther into Russia, the Russians used scorched earth tactics, which meant they burned their farms, burned their houses, destroyed any crops they could, so that Napoleon could not acquire proper food or shelter for his troops. Finally, Napoleon was approaching Moscow, which was not actually its capital at the time, but was still one of its most important cities. And the Russians fought a pitched battle against Napoleon at Borodino. The Russians lost, but they inflicted fairly high casualties on the French army, and they did not completely get their army destroyed, so it wasn't decisive. The French then marched into Moscow with the intention of staying there for the winter. However, the Russians decided to burn Moscow, one of their oldest, most famous cities, the former capital and current capital of Russia, and they did not surrender. And so now Napoleon was in a very difficult situation. The famous Russian winter, Russia's greatest soldiers, General Winter, was coming. And so Napoleon saw that he would be unable to survive in Moscow without proper shelter or food. So he ordered a retreat of his army from Russia. This retreat proved disastrous. The Russian army, who was used to this winter and better supplied for winter conditions, harassed the French army as they retreated. Many French were starving, freezing to death, not properly supplied for winter. Famous battles like where French would fall through like half-frozen rivers, and it was quite horrific for the French, and only about 10% of his Grande Armée made it out of Russia. So only about 60,000 out of 600,000. So this is a catastrophic defeat. And from there, Napoleon was continually pushed back all the way towards Paris. Prussia, Sweden, and Austria joined in the fight. Britain continued to push up in Spain. Finally, once the battle was back towards France, Napoleon's marshals pressured him to abdicate the throne. Abdicate means to leave the throne, surrender his position as emperor. Napoleon went into exile with a mini army in Elba off the coast of Italy. So he got to still pretend that he was emperor, and there he would go around and like march his little like mini army around and do drills, and it's kind of like a make-believe life. Louis XVIII, Louis XVI's brother, became the king of France. He was put in by the other countries. But he was not very popular, and Napoleon saw that if he returned, maybe he would be loved and could reestablish his empire. So he landed with his mini army. Louis sent the French army to arrest him. However, when the French army saw Napoleon, they defected and joined him, and Louis was the one that was forced to run away. And Napoleon gained more and more support as he marched on Paris. However, the countries of Europe were not about to accept this, and Britain and Prussia fought Napoleon in a combined battle at Waterloo. You'll also see a lot of Waterloo streets around British Empire cities. And Napoleon was decisively defeated at Waterloo. He almost won. And Napoleon was exiled to an island called St. Helena in the South Atlantic. This is one of the most remote places in the world. Napoleon said during his exile, "Able was I, ere I saw Elba." It's kind of a famous palindrome, I believe. And Napoleon lived for 6 more years on Elba, or on St. Helena, sorry, before he died. There's a few conspiracy theories about his death, but I think the official reason is stomach cancer. So here's Napoleon late in his life. He wasn't that old. I think he was in his 50s, early 60s.